Trudy Wisherman describes herself as a rural advocate, meaning that she is lover of the birds and the bees and the flowers and the trees, a friend of the farmer and all those who bend their backs to bring us food, and a proselytizer for the land. She lives in the small town of Lindsay. I know I've been there. I don't know about you all. Once the self-proclaimed olive capital of the world. There she writes a weekly column called Notes from Home, and I really recommend you check it out because it's inspiring. She does that for 2 independent newspapers, the Sun Gazette and Mid-Valley Times. These papers serve the historically small farm regions of the Kings and Kaweah Rivers. So let's give a welcome to Trudy Wisherman.
Oh boy, that's close. Good morning. I am so happy to be here. I want to thank my farmer friend Tom Willie for making this happen, and also thank Lori for getting here gently this morning. I may have misrepresented what I'm going to talk about to Lori. I'm not so much here to tell you about how we misuse the land as much as how we mishold it, and how that misholding it causes us to misuse it and each other. So, our scripture for this morning is from the book of Jeremiah, chapter 22, verse 29, through the pen of John Pitney, a Methodist minister, songwriter, rural advocate, and earthkeeper from Oregon, who I will be telling you about shortly. Land, 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 hear the word of the Lord. Yahweh. Land, 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 hear the word of the Lord. Your countryside is empty, and your city's fallen down. Oh, land, 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 hear the word of the Lord. Oh, land, oh, land, oh, land. When I first heard those words, during the Forum on Church and Land held here in Fresno in 1992. They had such an impact on me that it felt almost like a derailment. Your countryside is empty and your city's falling down. Those words perfectly describe the worst case scenario of the relationship between farm size and small towns that I'd given my life to for 15 years. But at that time, I had no idea the word of the Lord had anything to do with it. I'm 4th generation failed family farmer, which means I'm working class. I'm the daughter of a carpenter and a stay-at-home mom, almost the first one to go to college, and only thanks to the National Defense Education Act. I was raised without formal religion. In my family, church people were suspect and held at arm's length. If we had faith, it was in ourselves, the importance of community, and the golden rule. Occasionally, we'd join a church only to find it wanting and leave. In the late 60s, when the church in general supported the status quo, and my generation found it couldn't, we left in droves. Many never came back for good reason. So in 1991, when I got a call from some guy in Oregon named John Pitney, a Methodist minister, asking if I would participate in something called the Forum on Church and Land, I was skeptical. But I had a need for outlets, so I said yes. I was in the early stages of a public education project on agriculture and the common good funded by the California Council for the Humanities. I called it Seeing the Invisible, Mega Farms and the Rural Communities of California. The main element of that project was a fine photo exhibit on current farm worker conditions, but my real aim was to make people aware of the impacts mega farms had on towns. John's Forum sounded like a place where I might be able to raise people's awareness of this important inverse relationship that as farms get larger, towns get worse, and the inverse of that, the reverse of that, the flip side, which is that as farms get smaller, towns get better in every way: healthier, more prosperous, more democratic, more stable. In the late 1970s, I had learned about this relationship at Berkeley in the office of an old emeritus economics professor named Paul Taylor. Now, I loved Paul, and I could spend 3 days telling you about him, but here's the short version. Paul studied farm labor in the 1920s before it was popular. In the 30s, he tracked the Dust Bowl migrants into California with his photographer wife, Dorothea Lange. In the 40s until the 80s, he defended the 160-acre limitation of federal reclamation law until almost his dying day. As part of that effort, his student, Walter Goldschmidt, conducted what came to be known as the Arvin-Dinuba study, which compared two towns surrounded by different land tenure patterns. Arvin in Kern County was surrounded by large-scale absentee corporate farms, while Dinuba in Tulare County was supported by small-scale resident family farm operations. The study was undertaken to determine the importance of small farms to rural economic development. Funding for the Central Valley Project then was being debated in Congress, and the large landowners in the valley were trying to get the 160-acre limit removed. The landowners claimed that the limit wasn't appropriate for California-style agriculture. I mean, small farms were a thing of the past. But what the Arvin-Dinuba study showed was that the difference between the two towns was night and day. Dinuba, the small farm town, was a better place to live, to work, to play, to have a business, to get health care, to go to school and get educated, to meet socially, and even to worship God. The study implied that small farms not only still existed in the Central Valley, but that where they did, small towns flourished. So he wasn't very popular with the big growers. And the study's findings gave Congress the huevos they needed to keep the 160-acre limit attached to the Central Valley Project. But after that triumph, Paul Taylor spent the rest of his life documenting the way the big boys found to avoid enforcement of those provisions. He also spent time proclaiming to American citizens the importance of the small farms the law was supposed to promote and protect, and the monopolization of water the law was supposed to prevent. What the Arvin-Dinuba study did to me, though, when I finally got wind of what it was saying, was made me pick it up and go with it. And I can tell you exactly where and when it happened. It was here, in Fresno, at the convention center. It was a hearing on the Westlands Water District and about the lack of enforcement of the 160-acre law. It was summer 1977. I was with Paul and Martha Chase, his legal research assistant. George Ballas from National Land for People in Fresno gave testimony in his farm overalls. Willoughby Houck, who farmed 2,000 acres in Firebaugh, was there in his Stetson, also to protest the lack of enforcement in Westlands. John Harris, in his jeans and cowboy boots, slouched in the folding chairs right in front of us and guffawed through the whole thing, while Paul sat quietly with his typed testimony sitting on his lap. When they brought up the Arvin-Danuba study, which was then 35 years old, with its long, mind-numbing list of enumerated differences, and as the congressman questioned whether the relationship was still valid, given how big farms had grown nationally and the so-called economies of scale, I heard myself say, if they could only see the difference. Now, I hadn't seen the differences yet, and it would take me another 4 years before I got brave enough to set foot in this end of the valley, because I was sure I would get shot. But I brought a camera, and my first visit was kind of a hit and run. I did 3 or 4 rolls of film and spent about an hour in each town. But after I'd seen how different the 2 towns still were, I decided to update the study visually for my master's thesis. The next year, I came back with lots of film and base maps so I could plot each negative on the blocks where the buildings of schools and parks and towns were. And then I spent 2 years printing photographs and analyzing the photographs on the maps and writing it up. And then I brought this weighty draft manuscript back to my advisor, and he said, kindly, I don't see any difference between the 2 towns. And I think they both look kind of old and bedraggled in his urban eyes. And besides, he says, you can't say these differences are caused by farm size unless you have the data. Thank you for laughing. It's really that wasn't how I reacted when he said that. Now, getting farm size data at the community level is a little bit harder than you'd think. So I went to Davis, to Dean McCannell's macrosocial accounting project, where they had data. And what I learned after several years gathering data was that at UC Davis, where all those agribusiness folks were there, I could have all the data I needed up the wazoo. I could cross every T and dot every I, and they still would not believe or care that there's a relationship between farm size and towns, much less an inverse relationship. So, with that realization, I made the research into a public education project, and I ran it through the California Institute of Rural Studies for Rural Studies in Davis, where they did care. And that's where I was when John Pitney called and asked if I'd help plan his forum on church and land. Planning it was wonderful, even though I only understood the land half. And finally, we held the 4-day conference in early February in 1992. Very few people from California attended. It was mostly folks from the Midwest, where the churches had been engaged in the farm crisis in the 1980s. My project's farm worker photo exhibit was up, and I gave a presentation on the Arvin-Danuba study, which I ended up doing quite badly, getting tangled up in numbers. There was a Bible study on the 8th century BCE prophets given by Marvin Cheney from San Francisco Theological Union, which I avoided, not knowing it was on land tenure. In that Bible study, what they learned, the people who went, what they learned was that what the prophets were protesting was that all the good lands had been confiscated by the kings and priests, and they were being used to raise crops that were exported to get raw materials and gems and fine goods for building temples and wearing fine garments made of 2 fibers or more. And supporting their lifestyles, while the common people, the peasants, we called them, were pushed into small marginal plots of land that they could hardly grow anything to eat on. Many other California spokespeople were there. They contributed to the conference. Quaker Mac Warner from Acampo led a group on land ethics. Reedley Mennonite Paul Buxman was there to represent sustainable small farms. Father Bill Wood of the Catholic Rural Life Conference gave a wonderful keynote. Walt Perry of Fresno Metro Ministries was there, Pablo Espinosa, and researcher Don Villarejo, both farm labor activists, and Livingston's Lutheran minister Bill Ruth, whose church had started Casa de la Dignidad after the 1990 freeze, which linked unemployed farm workers with farmers who offered jobs. There was also a field trip, which I had a hand in planning, which took us from small farm Selma to large farm, semi-large farm Early March. I'd like to take you on that field trip. Come with me. It's Fresno, it's February, it's foggy and cold, as 40 or so of us climb on a bus and head south out of Fresno on 99. We stop in Selma at the 40-acre farm of Al Unruh, a Mennonite who grows raisins, nectarines, peaches, and plums. Al, like most family farmers, didn't think he had anything to say. But once he got started talking about his farm, he couldn't stop. We listened to stories about his long life on that land, about difficult markets and picky consumers, and his cares for the people who come work for him to pick fruit in summer and prune trees and vines in winter. No one wanted to leave Al's. But we climbed back on the bus anyway, and then zigzagged southeast toward Dinuba, one of the towns I'd told them about the day before, the good one with the business district, good schools, and parks. Then we head south to Lindsay, with a brief detour up Rocky Hill to a hairpin curve so we could look out over the citrus groves that were watered by the Frying Kern Canal. A little bit hairy getting down from there. And then we spend lunch in the old fellowship hall of the Methodist Church in Lindsay. And Dick Pitcher, who was the pastor then, described the freeze relief efforts he'd been involved in helping pull off. And those freeze relief efforts were still active 14 months later. After lunch, we walked downtown to the Lindsay Strathmore Coordinating Council and listened to their harrowing efforts to keep people from falling through the cracks, people who still had no work, not in the fields, not in the packing houses, no food, no rent money. We visit an ag chemical business that was managed by one of the Lindsay Methodists and hear about their financial losses. It was a full afternoon, and then we get back on the bus and head toward Early March. Passing Porterville as we turn southwest toward 99, the farms begin to get bigger, the mailboxes further apart, and the land seemingly more vacant. And because it's late winter, it's almost dark when we arrive. Early Mart was one of the South Valley towns noted for having a childhood cancer cluster. Joe Cardona, who was the town's barber, served as a spokesman for the families in that cluster. And he met us at the Methodist Church, which had not been open for a while. The families have prepared a meal for us of fresh salsa, tamales, chips, and punch. Joe took us aside and said we'd go into the sanctuary and let the families talk, but that we should pray first just so we would remember whose hands hold the destiny of these families. Here's what John Pitney wrote about that night. We moved from the fellowship hall to the old dusty sanctuary. It had been a long time since this household of God had been so full. Everyone held hands and prayed in 2 languages. As a mother began to speak, Bill Ruth, the bilingual Lutheran pastor from Livingston, asked if he could translate. For 3 hours, mothers, fathers, and children of cancer told their stories. Bill translated Spanish to English, English to Spanish, and we listened. They shared their struggles with lupus, leukemia, brain tumors, and cancers whose kinds and origins no one could explain. They told of labor contractors who would not inform the workers to be out of the vineyards and fields when pesticides were flown. They told of homes and neighborhoods sprayed because they were in the paths of planes. They told of babies born dead and children with deformities and not speaking up for fear of losing their jobs. We could have stayed in that sanctuary all night. Perhaps we should have paid the bus driver overtime. We hadn't planned for this. We had to get back. We closed our discussion, prayed again, and began to shuffle out when a young man raised his hand from the back pew and asked to speak. As a weary Bill Ruth strained to listen, we all froze where we were. The young man stood up and in broken English asked this question: "Will you be back?" We looked to Bill to translate as if we hadn't heard, but we'd heard. We had no reply. Now on the bus, it was a very quiet ride back to Fresno, I'm telling you. Will you be back? Most of the conference attendees were from the Midwest, so there was little chance they'd revisit Fresno, much less Early Mart. But those of us who had planned the conference felt the weight of the question, and I think it's fair to say that we were all changed on the Selma Early Mart Road. For the other planners, I think the change came from seeing the evidence of what happens when you move from small farms to large. I'd already seen that. What changed for me was seeing how much difference it made to have people look, especially people of faith. What also stunned me, I think, was realizing that there was nothing invisible about the relationship between farm size and community conditions. It's out there in plain sight if you know where to look and ask the right questions. It's taken me a little longer to realize that what we were seeing was not just the positive attributes of small farms and towns. What this relationship shows is that real economic development is trickle up, not trickle down. As Henry George wrote, all wealth comes from the land. And when that wealth moves up through many hands, community is built. When that wealth is scraped off the top and hoarded privately, it not only impoverishes the vast majority of people and raids the public storehouse of natural resources, it also paves the way for the demise of nations. And that's what Jeremiah was pleading about, crying out to the unhearing. Listen up, he said. Everything is at stake. And everything is still at stake. Now, I have not told you about Merrill Goodall, who is another student Paul Taylor supervised. Merrill's research on water districts has become incredibly important at this moment when our efforts to protect groundwater are being subverted and sabotaged by the big boys. Merrill was an avid Unitarian. And he was one of the most humble, decent men I have ever met, who was also relentless. On my handout, which I have to show you here, and I have these, you can come get them from me afterwards. On my handout, I've listed a piece that I wrote about Merrill's work about 3 years ago. And if anyone is interested in getting to know more about it, and even how it might help us save our aquifers, I would be glad to come back and meet with you just to see what kind of prophetic voice could come from that. Right now, I'd like to end with another snippet of a John Pitney song, because I'm hoping you'll be interested enough in this wacko Methodist to check out his website, which is also listed in the handout. I'm also hoping some of you might want to help me plan the next Forum on Church and Land, where we can see what people of faith could do to make this valley a better place, more equitable, more sustainable, more loving. Now, not all of John's songs are serious and in a minor key. About half are playful, laughing at ourselves as well as the status quo. And to me, they are full of life, the life of faith with the freedom to speak. So I'm going to end with the last verse of Get Down and Get Dirty. And this is also on the back of the handout. Get ready. So let us sing of farmers with their noses in the stuff, and workers risking life and limb so all can have enough, while striving to make better lands and life-sustaining yields, out sitting on their tractors and outstanding in their fields. Get down and get dirty, it's the name of the game. Get down and get dirty, 'cause we're made from the same. Yahweh still got gun dirty when she made us from the prairie. Fact that we're not now dirt is only temporary. Amen.